Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Stephen Siciliano. I'm the board president of the Traverse Area Historical Society. As we have a number of visitors today, I'd like to just take a moment to give you a quick overview of the Traverse Area Historical Society. We are a nonprofit 501c3. Our mission is to provide, to preserve, protect, and present the history of our region. Activities include this program, historical tours, archive support, scholarship support, and the support of local initiatives that recognizes the history of our region. We are all volunteer organization. We have no paid positions. We are governed by a board of directors, and we meet monthly upstairs, and those meetings are open to the public. The revenues from memberships and donations allow us to put on programs like this one today. Today's program is entitled The Cradle of Traverse City, Slabtown, based in part on a recent book, Slabtown, Traverse City's premier neighborhood. Marty MacLeod will trace the history of the West Side, the what and the who helped to transform that first shanty town into a vibrant neighborhood for today. Perhaps our audience will also share a few stories, one or two, about the Slabtown. Please welcome our board vice president and author, Marty MacLeod.
Thank you so much. I want to check to make sure, can everyone see the cursor? Because there are a few slides. Okay, good. There are a few slides that I'll want to point things out, and the Zoom people can see the cursor. So anyway, after I volunteered to come up with a program based on my Slabtown book, I asked my husband Stuart in the back there to flip through it and please jot down all the stories from it that he thought I should be sure to include. And then when he gave me the list, I just had to laugh because I said, Stuart, I can't stand up and read the entire thing to the audience. It made me laugh, but so I paged through it myself, and so that's a book if you haven't seen it. I realized as I was doing that it's the perfect vehicle, this talk, to also explain, not talk just about Slabtown, but also explain and highlight our immigrant heritage. So Traverse City began with a sawmill, and directly after that came Slabtown on its heels, or Little Bohemia, or Baghdad, or Slab City. You can take your pick. But before we get into it, we have to take a quick detour to the Chicago of 1850, because that's where the fateful meeting between Perry Hanna and Tracy Lay occurred. Both were ambitious young 20-somethings who, with the Morgan brothers, their silent partners, formed a wholesale lumber business under the name Hanna, Lay and Company. So this is Tracy Lay, Morgan, I can't remember which, Perry Hanna, this is the earliest picture we have of him, and Morgan brother, I can't remember his name. I don't remember which one he is. Also, I found this lithograph. There are no photographs that I've ever seen showing the Hanna Lay Company, but I came across this lithograph recently, and it's the elevators and lumber yards in South Chicago, which is where the Hanna Lay Company was located. So I'm sure that one of these guys here, it's got to be Perry Hanna and Tracy Lay, right? Anyway, it gives you an idea of what things were like where they started their company. But I will let them tell the story in their own words, thanks to two letters written in 1903. And we'll start with Mr. Lay's. Dear Sir, etc., etc. During the winter of 1850-51, Curtis, a millwright, brought our attention to a lumber mill site at Traverse Bay named Omena, which was then the name of the county. Captain Boardman was the owner, a sturdy old farmer, living at Naperville, And this is Boardman's deed to the property here, purchased federal lands, and it is signed by President Millard Fillmore. Boardman's son, back to the letter, Boardman's son went up in 1846 or 1847 and located the land at the head of West Traverse Bay, built a mill and dam, also a dock and a wood strap railroad out onto the dock, so as to haul lumber on a car with a single horse. And now Mr. Hanna's letter. I arrived in this place on the 5th of May, 1851, having left Chicago on the little schooner Venus in company with Captain Boardman. We dropped anchor at the west corner of the bay. Here, a slight slab dock. I think I have a, can you see that? Okay, so this is the bend in the Boardman right here. This is where the creek, now known as Kids Creek, comes in, and here's the mill and the dock out on West Bay. Let's see. Here, a slight slab dock had been built out. A little tramway had been run from this dock through the woods up to the creek, where a small mill with one upright saw had been built by Captain Boardman's son Horace a year or two before, and a small boarding house occupied by Mr. Boardman and his wife to board the men. Now, this is not the Boardman's mill. This is, however, a small water-powered mill on the Boardman, just to give you an idea of what it might have looked like. I don't know why no one brought a photographer along on this trip. That's very frustrating for me. So here also we found Mike Gay with his fiddle, and right good it sounded too. No happier little family ever huddled together than these 2 or 3 families. Arrangements had been made with the old captain for the purchase of the mill and the 200 or 300 acres connected with it, provided sufficient timber up the Boardman River could be found to warrant the location. A little company was organized for a week's trip up one side of the Boardman River and down the other, looking for pine lands. If 50 million feet of timber could be found belonging to the government, a deal for the mill was a sure go. I will here say that since that time, we have cut over 400 million on the banks of the Boardman. So Hannah plunked down $4,500, which is about $200,000 today, for the small and failing Boardman Mill, and about 200 acres of virgin pine forest where downtown Traverse City now stands. Tracy Lay immediately set to work on enlarging the mill, swapping out that little upright saw for circular saws, and upgrading from water power to steam power. And his letter picks up the story again. And notice they still don't have a name for this place. We engaged Curtis for millwright and sent him carpenters to frame out the mill. Then we loaded bricks, lumber, and steam boilers, but the schooner sprang a leak and had to return to Chicago and unload. We chartered a new ship, and I sailed up with her on August 28th, landing at Omena. I stayed till October. On November 20, we sent a load of supplies and other goods and took up a gang of men who worked in the woods that first winter, getting logs in 2 camps. William Rennie, Scotsman, arrived via Canada and signed on with Hannah and Lay as superintendent of logging operations. He laid out what would become Front Street, cutting the trees and pulling the stumps. He organized the company's Boardman River logging camps, hired crews, including any Anishinaabe men who were interested in the work. He set up the buildings for camp operations, and he constructed a supply road through the wilderness all the way from the mill. A strict disciplinarian, His word was law, and at 370 pounds with a 58-inch chest and 22-inch neck, you can see how that might have worked. So, it's said that he could pick up an ordinary sized man and toss him about as if he were playing with a young child. So the Rennie family has been a mainstay of Slabtown and Slabtown and Traverse City ever since. Unlike their fellow lumber barons, who clear-cut one forest and moved on to the next, both Hannah and Leigh wanted their little wilderness settlement to prosper. So what to do? The boarding house was not suitable for women or families, which they hoped to encourage, both to keep down the rowdiness and to help little Traverse City grow. Partners decided to offer a fringe benefit. The workers could help themselves to the first offcuts, and these were referred to as slabs, to build homes for themselves, and it worked a charm. When it came to construction, methods varied considerably. Some men nailed the slabs vertically to a simple box frame. Others stacked and nailed the slabs like pancakes. Still others, more conventionally, nailed their slabs horizontally to studs or logs. Windows were small and few, so that a decent wood stove could heat the space comfortably, and the interior side of the slab walls were frequently tar papered against the wind. Men started sending for their womenfolk, both whites and Anishinaabe, and it didn't take long for an entire neighborhood of one-room shanties to spring up just east of the mill, and it was christened Slabtown. So here I have superimposed some of the features on a later map that shows streets where there were none at the time. There were no streets at all. Just so you can get your bearings. So the Bend and the Boardman right here, and this is what we now call Kids Creek, which at the time was known as Mill Creek, then Asylum Creek, and now Kids Creek. So this is Front Street. Now this is Division. Oh, this is horrible. This is Division. This is Division Street. So almost at that intersection, so just north and east of the current Front Street and Division Street was where the dam and the mill were located. This, of course, is also Asylum Mill Creek, but once the dam was built, it's the mill pond. So if you've ever been at Ace Hardware on Front Street, that's basically, and you know that big drop off, that was the mill pond right there. So this was the little tramway that went through the woods out to the small dock here. So there was a single two-room structure in the mix, and that was Perry Hannah's residence, which his wife Anne jokingly referred to as the Shanty Palace. So, and I will just mention this because I talk about it later. This is the second mill site down here on the Boardman River and the docks out on West Bay. So eventually, the Hannah home was enlarged and greatly improved, but the Hannahs lived here on Bay Street, right about where Hotel Indigo is today, for 40 years. It was clear from the start that the young Mr. Hannah had an uncanny knack for recognizing, attracting, and rewarding good men. And it's my opinion, at least, that this was the crux of his and also Traverse City's success. Come on in. There are a couple seats up here. It's quite difficult now to appreciate just how isolated the village was for its first 15 years. Folks referred to leaving town as going outside. There were no roads. other than Indian trails, and certainly no railroads yet. The only way in or out was by water. And then only when both Lake Michigan and West Bay were navigable. So between April and December, generally, depending on the season. Supplies critical to the survival of the settlement, including horses and chickens and livestock, all arrived the same way. The company built a little store near the sawmill in 1853, which every fall had to bring in enough supplies to last through the following spring. Most families did keep a cow, and Hannah and Leigh usually slaughtered an old work oxen about every week so folks could buy fresh meat. So here's the earliest view we have from 1860. And here's the store. It was a 12 by 16 foot building that one pioneer woman described as having a few pieces of calico and just enough dry goods. But as ragamuffin little Traverse City started to grow, so too did the company store. And here is a much later, let me move that. Here's a much later photo. And note along the roof ridges, all of the barrels collecting rainwater just in case there was a fire. So, in 1860, the company bought the little Allegheny to run a regular weekly route carrying foodstuffs. I'm sorry for the quality. It's the only photograph of the Allegheny. A regular weekly route carrying foodstuffs and dry goods and furnishings and hardware and other supplies from Chicago and lumber from the mill back to Chicago on her return. As early farmers followed the lumberjacks, they uprooted countless stumps and eventually began producing surplus crops, starting with potatoes and then apples, pears, plums, not so much cherries yet, and the store provided a ready market. By 1855, the settlement was beginning to take on some appearance of permanency, although there are still no photographs to prove it. So this is the earliest view we have of Front Street, and it's from 1865. The partners, who had been splitting their time between Chicago and Traverse City, Leigh here in the summer and Hannah in the winter, decided that Leigh should just stay in Chicago to manage company headquarters, while Hannah would handle all things operational here in the North Woods. By 1858, the company's lumbering operation had grown to such an extent that the partners decided it was time for a major upgrade. So they converted that original sawmill on the creek into a grist mill to help feed the growing population, both human and animal. And they built a huge sawmill directly downstream, directly on the Boardman River, and big new docks behind it on West Bay. So the logs were taken up the ramp there, sawn, and pushed out the back and loaded on the boats. According to its first census in 1860, Traverse City had 118 laborers living in the company boarding house, also 28 farmers and several tradesmen, but even so, it still wasn't much to brag about, as accounts from early arrivals attest. Miss Ada Sprague came here at 17 with her mother and later wrote, "I wish I could make you see Traverse City as I saw it that beautiful morning in 1861. I did not expect a very large city, but the name seemed such a misnomer. There was no house near the Leelanau County line except on the corner of what is now Bay and Elmwood. Albert Bacon built a small dwelling and called the place Lincolnville. Apparently he was a fervent Lincoln Republican. There was an old mill about at the corner of Division and Front Streets. Mr. Hannah's cottage was on Bay Street. Farther north were some old hay sheds. Then came some rude dwellings used by the millmen with families. The location on Bay Street was known as Slab City, and all the houses west were located in Baghdad. There was a certain jealousy between these localities, and I always suspected the Slab Cityites felt more aristocratic because they possessed the one house with a real brick chimney, and the Baghdadites were possibly envious of it. Thomas Bates arrived the following year, 1862, and later recounted, "Our boat, the Allegheny, came snorting up the bay just as the sun emerged from the forests of the peninsula. We landed and walked through piles of lumber to the sawdusted street. There were a dozen or so buildings on Front Street, and beyond lay a bunch of shanties. Back then, everyone was too busy with the sterner duties of life to engage in recreation. Nearly all of the men were employed by Hannah Lay and Company, and the women were simply worn out. There was an occasional bit of jollity, but where everyone saw everyone during the day, there was no special inducement to play at meeting each other socially." When asked years later to describe Traverse City society in those days, this is Ada again, Ada quipped, "It would be difficult to tell of a thing that didn't exist. There was certainly nothing which could have answered to that name." After the first bit of homesickness wore off for new arrivals, we liked it, the hamlet and the bay and each other, which was certainly very fortunate. And so we proceeded to have just as good a time as possible under the circumstances. It actually sounds pretty dismal. Perry Hanna had to literally bribe Dr. Benjamin Ashton with $1,000 to get him here. And yes, that is the family for whom Slabtown's Ashton Park is named. But folks continued to arrive, strongly encouraged by Hannah and Lay, and an entrepreneurial spirit started taking hold. One of these early entrepreneurs was Slabtown's Albert Bacon, whom Ada mentioned earlier. A former surveyor, he teamed up with two others to open a general store and a blacksmith shop in 1860. Bacon was a lively man, and he owned 2 Indian ponies, which were the only horses in town not in constant use. Ada notes that he would offer friends and neighbors sleigh rides to the occasional potlucks and dances as far afield as Elk Rapids. Ada herself quickly joined the nascent business community as well, within just a month of her arrival. And remember, she's 17. She announced the grand opening of a millinery shop to be run out of her Front Street home. With so few women as potential customers, it was a gutsy move, especially for a 17-year-old, or maybe only because she was a 17-year-old. Eventually, she expanded from handmade bonnets into hoop skirts, perfumes, toilette articles, sewing notions, and china dolls. At 24, she married Edwin Pratt, an up-and-coming attorney, but it was more than a decade and 3 children later that she gave up her shop. Ada was very active in the village's, by then, growing social and cultural life, and the Pratt's home, Hillcrest, still stands today. That's on Jefferson Street, and you can actually see it from West Front Street if you look up the hill. Perry Hanna, in fact, was not at all averse to such competition, understanding full well that it could only benefit the village if talented and ambitious folks were encouraged to make their fortunes here rather than go elsewhere. He underwrote most of the early businesses in town, many of which were in direct competition with Hanna, Lay and Company interests and started by his own employees. For example, here is Joseph Greilich, a familiar name, if not necessarily a familiar face. Joe and his father Gottlieb, also known as Godfrey, had opened a small sawmill in 1854 near the village then known as Norrisville. After they dissolved their partnership in 1861, Joe signed on as a carpenter and mill hand with Hannah Lay and Company, where it took Perry Hannah no time at all to recognize his leadership skills. Joe rose quickly to become a supervisor of the blacksmith shop and all of the company store buildings except the dry goods department. Perry Hannah was very supportive when Joe started thinking of striking out on his own, and the two formed Joseph E. Greilich and Company. And Hannah sold him the company's original sawmill to convert to a planing mill. It became the foremost supplier of dressed lumber, siding, flooring, door frames, and window sashes, blinds, and moldings. Greilich bought Hannah out in 1879 and built a two-story, state-of-the-art sawmill on the bay at the north end of Division Street. In 1884, it was awarded the contract to supply all of the window frames for the new Northern Michigan Asylum, thereby ensuring the company's success. Greilich's mill employed 10% of Traverse City's workforce and most of Slabtown's until the Great Depression forced its closure in 1929. Joe, his wife Nancy, and their 7 children lived in this lovely home on Bay Street, which passersby still admire today. But as you will soon learn, the Greilichs played an even more seminal role in the cultural development of Slabtown and Traverse City as a whole. Let's skip forward briefly to 1923, when the Traverse City Women's Club assigned Miss Mary Rutner the task of compiling and documenting the waves of Bohemian immigration to our area. Mary, whose own parents had emigrated in 1868, was rather reluctant to take on this daunting assignment. As she says in the introduction to her manuscript, Bohemia on the Boardman, it's like the Great War. You've got to be on the firing line to know, and then you can't tell it in words. If settling a frontier was hard for the English-speaking races, how much more so it must have been for those to whom the language and customs were strange, for this often exposed them to the ridicule of the thoughtless, and there's nothing much harder to bear. In this setting, I can't really do justice to Mary's work or to a similar journal kept by a young Prokop Kasulka, but I'll give you the story in a nutshell. And it literally does begin with a nutshell. In the early 1850s, in the town of Andrejev, near Prague, the talk was all of emigration. Circulars from a land agent in Cincinnati had somehow found their way describing in the most alluring terms the opportunities awaiting those who would take up his offer in the land of the free. During one assembly, a Brazil nut was handed around as an essay on the American Garden of Eden was read, no one realizing that it was actually talking about Brazil. No matter, the goal was the United States, and the exodus from Andrejev began in 1854. A prosperous young storekeeper, Joseph Wilhelm, and his wife Ava persuaded a great number of relatives and friends to this venture. So I have a few pictures of some of the very early Bohemians who came to town, so I'll just kind of go through them as I talk so you can get familiar with them. The group were not wealthy, but were by no means paupers either. They all had good common school educations. The men had learned trades, and their wives were skilled needlewomen. From Prague, they went to Bremen, and then on to Bremerhaven on Germany's north coast, where a whale skeleton set up for people to walk through made quite an impression on the young Prokop. Coming from a landlocked area, the Bohemians were puzzled to see all of the fishing boats lying about in the mud and were astonished when the tide came in and set them all afloat. They set sail with 120 passengers, most of them Bohemian, and the voyage took nearly 2 months. It was a very difficult crossing, and many of the children had to be hospitalized on arrival in New York. After taking some time to recuperate, most of the families made for Chicago, and a more discouraged and homesick crowd could hardly be imagined. Unfamiliar with the language and without acquaintances, they were by now also much reduced in funds. Crowded together into cheap rooms, they tried to find work, but sickness and near poverty found them. Then, by great coincidence, they met Gottlieb Greilich down by the docks. He spoke Czech, wonder of wonders, and had come to Traverse City looking for men to work in his sawmill. One of the group, Frank Cradle, went north with Greilich in 1855 to investigate. He was gone a whole month, and his family lived in dread that he had been scalped. But the report on his return was favorable, and many others followed, but at least 10 families made up that first wave to Traverse City. On arrival, they discovered a dock, the sawmill and company store, the boarding house, Perry Hanna's house, and 4 or 5 shanties erected practically on the dock itself. Front and Union Streets were simply logging roads, and blueberries could be had for the picking, the full length of Front Street. So here's this early photo again with the mill and the dock, and this is still 5 years after they arrived. The only accommodation they could find was a long roofless shed on the dock, so they improvised a roof with tree branches. And this served as living quarters until they could get established and build their own log houses. They even planted a potato patch right by the dock, which Perry Hanna's mules raided continuously. As the men became friendly with the local Anishinaabe, they were invited to join fishing and hunting trips, where they learned to smoke fish and dry venison and the meat of wild pigeons. These first families, Wilhelms and Petertils, Cradevilles, Krupas, Bartaks, and Kaselkas, formed the nucleus of Traverse City's proud immigrant heritage. Many others arrived, lured by opportunities in the lumber camps and the mills. Mary emphasizes that their skills, industry, and thrift were well known and widely respected. One wit noted that Bohemians are honest, at least until they're Americanized. But local doctors and shopkeepers seldom, if ever, lost when they advanced credit to an old country Bohemian. Sharing those early challenges on our Northwest frontier, and there were many, forged bonds that endured to the ends of their lives. The young Prokop Kaselka, just 10 when he left Bohemia, eventually moved with his parents, who you see here, to 40 acres, 3 miles south of the settlement. According to his journal, which he kept faithfully, their land was dense with hardwoods, not the coveted king pine, so it was simply cut and burned at a rate of 3 acres a year for a log house and their farmland. At 16, Prokop took a job loading lumber boats, but discovered he could make better money, $2 a day, picking wild berries that he sold to the likes of Mrs. Hanna, and this is Prokop himself, in his later years, obviously. When the Civil War was declared, Little Traverse City more than fulfilled its call-up, and wages shot from $8 a month to $40. And Prokop noted that a poor workman could earn as much as a good one. So he took a job in the Hanalei lumber camps, cutting 75 trees a day with his partner. Tacitly acknowledging his own lack of ability, he wrote, "The other gang, 2 Norwegians weighing over 200 pounds each, looked like polar bears, averaged 125 a day." In 1865, at 21, Prokop apprenticed as a carpenter. His aunt and uncle, arrived with their 14-year-old adopted daughter. And love-struck, Prokop wrote, "She slapped a kiss on my face and I never wiped it off." They married 2 years later and paid $50 for a little house at the water's edge on Bay Street. The couple had 11 children, but only 6 lived beyond the age of 4. A hard worker, Prokop earned his papers in 1868, but Perry Hanna, who never could get his name right and called him Proper, immediately recruited him to work at the company store. Prokop and a partner eventually opened their own general store, Buck and Kaselka, at the corner of Front and Cass Street, and it was a landmark for over 40 years. As the village began to grow, both Slabtown and what we now call Old Town became home to the bulk of Traverse City's immigrant population. This house still stands, looks very different, but it's right next to the ice cream store, Dairy Lodge. So next time you go get an ice cream cone, you can admire this house. Let's see. The old saw was that the business owners lived in Boardman neighborhood and their workers lived on the south and west sides. With little transportation available, other than one's own 2 feet, it made great sense to live near where you were. The mills and factories, and eventually the rail yards, fronting Boardman Lake and West Bay. This is Greilick's sawmill from the water tower. While Greilick's sawmill was the primary West Side employer, especially early on, Bohemian Charles Prohatska opened the Michigan Starch Company on Bay Street in 1899. It made primarily livestock feed, first from all those potatoes, and then from corn and other grains, 3,000 bushels a day. Imagine my delight to discover a box of the company's North Star potato flour at an estate sale. You'll note that one side is printed entirely in Czech for the benefit of Bohemian housewives not yet comfortable with English. Speaking of housewives, there weren't nearly so many decent employment opportunities for those of the female persuasion, although young women and girls could find mind-numbingly boring work as cigar rollers with Traverse City's 30 or so cigar companies. Thomas Fitch, as you'll see from his ad, was one of the smaller independent West Side manufacturers. Work at that time meant 9, 10, 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Pay was generally low, but especially for women who were barred from joining trade unions. Yeah. By 1915 or so, female cigar rollers typically earned $5 a week, which didn't come close to covering rent and groceries. But it did cover a cigar. But the Straub Brothers and Amiati Candy Company opened in 1899 and offered a goodly number of Slabtown women employment. By 1904, that first factory was so profitable that the owners built this 4-story plant just blocks away, and you will recognize it as North Peak Brewing. 60 or so candy girls were pumping out 3,000 pounds of sweets a day, and SB&A was shipping across the country. But there's an unsavory side story that unfortunately was not unique to the Times or to Traverse City. In 1919, a headline in the Grand Traverse Herald proclaimed, "Woman's loose tongue passes malicious lie that hurts industry." An outspoken cigar roller claimed to have overheard one of the Straub brothers urging her boss not to overpay his girls, adding that he didn't need to pay his candy girls more because they were just bohunks, a slur against his many Bohemian employees. The Straubs stoutly defended their wage scale to the readers. quote, "Our minimum wage is $5 a week, and we have girls making 2 and 3 times this amount. They do piecework, and the efficient girls draw good pay. We wish the girls would take sufficient interest in their work so we could pay them $20 a week." Yeah. Eventually, under legal threat, that poor cigar roller recanted, but not before all the girl candy makers were ready to walk out over both the demeaning language and their poor wages. As it turned out, the candy market underwent a rapid change soon after, from bulk candy to bars, and the Straubs lost business to Mars and Mr. Hershey. The company folded in 1929, an early victim of the Great Depression. Anyway, with so many industrious bohemians in the mix, it was perfectly natural for the West Side to grow into something of a self-sustaining community. The neighborhood was peppered with smaller bohemian-owned businesses, providing the necessities of everyday life. The Hampel family, some of whom you see here, and some of whom you see here, was known for its locksmithing and firearms business and made its home in Slabtown for 4 generations. The West Side was also home to 3 big dairies. Oh, sorry, that's Mr. Hampel. Sorry. The West Side was also home to 3 big dairies, including Max Bauer's Creamery on West Front and Ideal Dairy, which was started by the Wiedoeft family on Monroe Street. And you can see much the same set of buildings there still today. That's on Monroe Street. Although Olson's eventually came to dominate both the West Side and most of Traverse City, there were plenty of early bohemian-owned grocery stores and butcher shops, including Stepan's and Urban's meat markets, and Kradovak's, there's no photo, and Hanslowski's grocery stores, which were both on Randolph. The longest lived, Ehrenberger's Grocery, gave Olson's a run for its money for more than 45 years. A detailed family history opens a window into life on the West Side around the turn of the century. Frank Ehrenberger, the elder in this photo, came to Slabtown from Bohemia in 1887 and found work driving a delivery wagon for Perry Hanna. His son Joe, who is second from right, graduated from the new high school in 1900, and he and a partner bought and stocked a storefront grocery on the corner of Front and Cedar Streets in 1910. It took the two nearly 5 weeks of nighttime work to lift, turn, and move that building 1 full block east to the corner of Front and Division Street. Even so, the locals continued to shop throughout the entire process. Shortly after all that work, Joe was able to buy out his partner. And Joe is here, and his partner. Joe's in the apron toward the right. Oh, I guess I can use this. That's Joe, and that was his original. The store carried canned goods and dry goods, as well as cheese, butter, eggs, molasses, and bulk cookies and crackers, all of which was delivered free daily to Slabtown housewives. Fresh vegetables, of course, were available only in season. The store also sold kerosene for cooking, heating, and lighting. Most customers would bring a 1 or a 5-gallon can for their purchase with a potato stuck on the spout to keep it from sloshing on the way home. But one little old lady always brought her lamp carefully wrapped in a blanket for Joe to fill himself. Ehrenberger's supported 130 or so regular customers, and as most grocers of the time, Joe offered credit. Looking back in later years, he estimated that he'd lost less than 1% in non-payment. There was one light-fingered fellow who made off with a large bag of flour and needed to be taught a lesson. So Joe tainted another large bag of flour with some of that kerosene, and he placed it off to the side where the man might be again tempted to help himself. On his next visit, the fellow warned Joe that he should store his kerosene elsewhere because it was making the flour taste really bad. He was highly incensed when he was informed why that was so, and he never returned. Store clerks were paid $7.50 a week, and the store was open from 7:30 in the morning till 6 p.m. on weekdays until 10 p.m. on Saturdays, because that's when the farmers came to town. Entire families would arrive by the wagon load or by sleigh in the winter, bringing eggs by the gross, potatoes by the bushel, and butter in 5-pound crocks. Ehrenberger sold about 100 pounds of that butter every Saturday, and Joe claimed he could tell which farm produced which butter just by the taste. He could also judge the weight of a cut of cheese from a huge cloth-covered wheel to within an ounce, or maybe two. Like Olson's, Ehrenberger's was a Slabtown icon, but Joe finally sold his last pound of butter to retire in 1956. Needless to say, with its abundance of bohemians, there were plenty of places to slake one's thirst on the west side. Through the years, there were saloons belonging to Ludwig Krupa, Anton Topinka, Frank Kuchera, John and Wenzel Kauer, and Joseph Klepach. Oh, let me flip through them again. This is in Bay Bread, the building where Bay Bread is now. And the story goes that there was a red light on the top of the building. There's Joseph. But the granddaddy of them all was Sledders. I may not be able to tell you anything you don't already know about this venerable institution, the longest continuously operating restaurant in the whole state. But here it goes. Wenzel Sledder was born in 1850 and became a skilled wheelwright. He emigrated to Traverse City at 32 and was eventually able to bring his wife, Catherine, and their 4 children over as well. In 1882, Wenzel decided to build a venue where his fellow Bohemians could relax after their very long work days. With his neighbors' help, he built his Tavern of Slabs, a process that took 3 years of Sundays, that being their only available workday. The basement floor had to be poured 4 times to a depth of 18 inches because the water table is so high on the west side. Wenzel, the sly dog, kept a roaster running in the basement and offered free peanuts at his bar. To any complaint that they were too salty, he would point out, "That's what gives the boys a thirst." When his son Louis was a boy, it was his job to clean the tavern's 21 spittoons for a quarter a pop, which was good money for a really nasty job. Wenzel's daughter-in-law, Leopoldine, known as Polly, helped to establish the tavern's famous "goodwill is good business" policy, throwing in a double shot and a free beer if you bought a full case at $1.50. Despite the best efforts of local ministers, the Salvation Army, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, there were 18 saloons in Traverse City in 1894 and 31 by 1905. Although Wenzel died in 1904, his son Louis was savvy enough to keep the place open throughout Prohibition, which in Michigan began early in 1918. Beyond the soft drinks and the hearty meals on the menu, he sold special root beer, bourbon and rye, served in teacups, and it was always free to local enforcement officials. Louis's son, also Louis but spelled differently, Then in his early 20s, drove to Chicago every 2 weeks on the deplorable unpaved roads of the day. He had a fashionable full-length raccoon coat and would remove the rumble seat from his snazzy Ford Roadster to make room for the grain alcohol he bought from the Capone gang. It's said that Al Capone even made a few deliveries up here himself. It arrived in 5-gallon tins, and Louis would convert it into gin or whiskey by adding the proper essence. Near beer was spiked with alcohol to reach normal potency. By contrast, just a few blocks away on West Front Street, the crew at Little Bohemia had run off 2 armed gangsters who showed up, demanding that Frank Kuchera buy his liquor from Al Capone as well, or else. Though I could never actually discover where Frank sourced his hooch. That said, Louis piously boasted that nothing has ever happened in my establishment that hasn't also happened in church. So apparently his prolific, no profane language, no gambling, no loafing, and no dancing signs really did the job. There may have been no dancing in the bar, but before the second floor Columbia Hall ballroom was converted to living quarters, there was a well-used dance floor and stage where bands played and acting troupes performed, always in check. Over vehement protests, women were allowed into the main room starting in 1930. Previously, as with most such establishments, they'd been confined to the small back room, probably already know, here, with its separate entrance. One knowledgeable gentleman has informed me that the same held true for any Anishinaabe patrons, though you won't find that written down anywhere. Children weren't allowed in such hellholes, of course, but plenty of Slabtown kids showed up just before their fathers got home from work to fetch a bucket of ice-cold beer for 10 or 15 cents, lining up outside while the bartender filled their pails. This ritual was known all around town as rushing the can. In his later years, Louis fondly recalled what he referred to as the West Side's old world tang. Geese trotted around the mud puddles in the middle of the streets, squawking and scolding when they had to get out of the way of a horse buggy or farm wagon. All of the older ladies wore what are now called babushkas. That was one way we could tell the latecomers from Bohemia. Their women all wore those businesses on the head, winter and summer. One little old lady used to come around each summer selling wild red raspberries. She wore a gingham dress down to her ankles, a white apron, a babushka on her head, and was always barefooted. She used to get 10 cents for a 2-quart pail of those luscious berries. West Side life centered largely around the Greilich factory, where most of the men worked. At noon, they made a beeline for Sledder's or Cower's saloon for their glass of beer, and in the evenings, these 2 pleasant places were the West Side club rooms. So that said, Traverse City's Bohemian community had a more official gathering spot as well. The first lodge for the local Czech-Slovak Protective Society, or CSPS, was somewhere on 9th Street. Founded in 1854, the local chapter formed in 1888. Organized by and for Czech immigrants, it began by offering a sort of insurance program that provided for members if they fell ill and covered funeral expenses if necessary. The CSPS became a model for later fraternal benefit societies all across America. So if you remember Mutual of Omaha, same sort of thing. Although not a secret society, it did have elaborate rituals, passwords, and secret door knocks. As the local society grew, it moved to a more prominent building on Union Street in Old Town, and then to an imposing brick lodge on West Front Street, obviously still standing. And it was a proud testament to the community. The local JCD, Union of Bohemian Ladies, was one of hundreds of such progressive chapters patterned after the CSPS that quickly spread throughout the country. Here's the JCD. Most of Traverse City's Bohemians held to the Catholic faith. St. Francis Church had been built in 1889 at 10th and Cass Streets. But it was clear within just a few years that a second Catholic church would be needed to accommodate the growing congregation. Working class parishioners on the west side found the old town location inconvenient, and some, frankly, felt looked down upon and unwanted. So they started lobbying for a church where they could attend services in their own language. This was the inception of Immaculate Conception, or what was known at the time as the West Side Catholic Church. Fundraising for a combined church and school began in 1902, and the first floor 3-room school opened just in time for the 1905 school year with 80 students. Immaculate Conception Church was dedicated the following year by the Bishop of Grand Rapids in a 4-hour-long standing room only service attended by 700 people and 17 priests. The greatest disadvantage to a second-floor church was realized only when it came time to conduct the first parish funeral. And that steel-lined casket had to be carried up and down the inadequate stairway. In the early days of Traverse City, the west side was served by the one-room Elmwood Primary School. Several years after a larger school was built, the little clapboard building was purchased by the Latter-day Saints, and today can be seen at its third location on Pine Street. An impressive new school on the corner of Randolph and Elmwood was completed in 1892, one of 5 built around town on land donated by Perry Hanna. Here you can see it dominating right here. The neighborhood at center left. I found it fascinating to learn that West Side kids still spoke Czech and their other native languages until 1936, when the school district mandated that only English be spoken in the classroom. It's a real tribute that so many immigrant families were able to maintain their culture and language for so many generations. So, and here is the 8th grade, Elmwood School's 8th grade graduating class in 1950. I've been remiss so far in addressing the reason behind Slabtown's slow westward creep from its birthplace east of Division to where we generally think of Slabtown today. So the neighborhood has gone through 2 major transformations since its incarnation as a lumber mill shanty town. The first began when, skip to it. That's the graduating class. There we go. I kept thinking that wasn't right. Okay. The first transformation began when 2nd and Randolph Streets were platted in 1880. Always intended to be transitional, many of those earliest slab houses were demolished by 1881. 3rd Street was platted a decade later, and the majority of its current homes were built after the turn of the century. That said, look closely at this photo of the slab towns down on the waterfront, and look at the far, far right. That's Perry Hanna's mansion on 6th Street. It's quite a view. So this was at least 1893 when these houses were still standing. Traverse City's third railroad, the Manistee and Northeastern, was organized in 1887, and the passenger station was on 2nd Street, where it used to intersect with Union. 2nd and 3rd Streets both went all the way to Union Street at the time. So the passenger station was here on 2nd Street, but the engine house and the rail yard were on West Bay, just east of Oak Street. The tracks ran right along the water, and again, looking closely at this photo of the rail yard, in the far upper right, it's very faint. This was Perry Hanna's house. He lived right at the rail yard. Let's see. So the tracks ran right along the water. And in 1893, when Perry Hanna was finally convinced to move, Bay Street was platted for industrial use, except for the one block between Oak and Maple Street, which was platted residential. 10 homes were built, backed up against the tracks, and there are a few of them still standing here, as you can see. And the residents immediately erected a continuous fence to screen the noise and the coal dust of 2 trains daily up and back from Northport. The other thing to point out here is this is a later picture, but this is the rail yard, and this was a roundabout for the M&N-E. Slabtown's second transformation came as plans for the Grandview Parkway swung into high gear. 9 of those 10 Bay Street houses were demolished between 1948 and 1951 to make way. But the 10th was moved to the corner of 2nd and Oak, where it still stands. As you can see in this long view of Bay Street, the rail yard, which is up here, this area, and some of the tracks were removed. There are astonishingly few photographs of the parkway's building progress. Here's the end result. And just look how shiny and bright it looks. The remaining tracks, so this was the rail yard and the roundabout and the tracks here and here. And look, they even still cross the Parkway and Front Street. Those were not removed until 1983. In the last 50 years, we've made good progress in reclaiming and beautifying the West Bay waterfront. Slabtown will never return to its bayside beginnings. And then again, I'm not entirely sure that some of those earliest forebears would even want it to. That's the end. So are there any questions or comments or Slabtown stories? Anyone wants to share? Yes.
I noticed that like the early 18 or 1900s, turn of the century, I could see in some of the photos evidence of power plants, right? So
yes.
Where was that being generated? Background on that?
That was primarily from dams that were being built on the Boardman River, progressively farther and farther away from town. So the first dam, the Union Street Dam, that was built to power the grist mill. So that was not a power generating dam. But the next one, what was the next one? Some of you guys. Brown, that was the next one? Okay, then Brown Bridge Dam. So that's where there was also the Traverse City Gas Company. That wouldn't be the power lines, obviously. And some of those lines may have been telephone lines as well, because telephones arrived in Traverse City in the late 1880s.
Yeah, there's some pictures of remote here.
Yeah.
So it's got these.
Yep. Yes.
So you can mention early on at some point, I guess when Traverse didn't have its name, when did it get its name?
When did Traverse City actually get its name? Pretty early on, but not right at first. And it's a good story. So Old Mission was established much before Traverse City was. And it was known since the mission was still there. It was not Old Mission at the time. It was called Grand Traverse. They had a post office and the mail would come by boat from Mackinac and be delivered to Grand Traverse. And so when Traverse City got started by Hannah and Lay, so 1851, by 1852, they decided that Traverse City needed a post office as well. So Tracy Lay got on the train, or well, ship first, and then train all the way out to Washington, D.C., met with post office officials. And so Lay was wanting to call this Grand Traverse City. But the officials in Washington said, oh, no, that's way too confusing. You can't have Grand Traverse and Grand Traverse City. So they named it Traverse City. Yes.
I come from one of the old Washington families on 2nd Street. I'm in one of the houses. So I can remember all the accents of the old people on the block. But my dad, when he was born there, he could speak 5 or 6 languages. He said he had to in order to get things done. He wanted the old guys to help people. So I had to know that. But I think there was about 1939 or so. It was in maybe 6th or 7th grade. They had English only because these kids would come to school and the teachers didn't like it because they felt so many So it all went vanilla.
And
I have 2 Louis Sletter stories.
could you come up so that the people on Zoom can?
I know I have a terrible voice.
Oh.
These are very quick, very short stories. And so anybody has a microphone? Seems like the perfect audience. My husband's grandfather's name was Charles McGee, and he had a house on Spruce Street just south of Randolph. And my mother-in-law told me that when she was a girl, she would go to Sletter's, and Louis would, and I didn't know that there was a thing about you called them buckets, and she always said pail, and she would take get a pail of beer and take it home to her grandfather, and it would just go on his credit or something, and they would not. So, and I kind of only half believed her, but I know that was true. And and then the other one involves my husband, who was kind of a devious little kid anyway, I think. But he and his pals, not just once, but a couple times, it turns out that the parking lot that's now at Sletter's used to just be a field, and they had goats there. I don't know if you heard about that. And so he and his friends, and I suspect they were probably about 7th grade. That's when boys do things like that. They were playing, it was in the early 1950s, so with all the cowboy shows on TV, so they would all have their rope sets with the lassos, and they go down and they lasso the goats. And Louis Sletter would come out and say, "You boys get away from there and stop this." And they didn't do it just once, but several times. And finally, Louis, this must have been the second Louis then, in the 1950s, early. Yeah, and it turns out he knew most of the boys, and they were all in kind of the same Boy Scout troop. And so he called the leader, and he said, I want these boys, they've been having fun with the goats, and now I want them to know what it's like to take care of them. And also, I have some cleanup work to do, and I think that they owe it to me. And so 2 or 3 times then they'd have to come back, but they got to know the goats, and he'd explain it wasn't really good to lasso and haul them around. And so anyway, I just think it must have been a different time, right?
Great. Thank you.